My name is Martha Blomquist, and I'm a senior site manager with the National Council of Juvenile and Family Court Judges. And for those of you who may not be familiar with the NCJFCJ, we are the oldest judicial membership organization in the United States. We provide training and technical assistance to judicial officers who handle juvenile and family law matters, as well as to court professionals and other practitioners who work with court-involved youth and families. And I am very pleased to welcome you to today's webinar, and I appreciate you taking the time to participate in our program. So today's webinar is intended to provide resources and tips for judges and juvenile probation professionals to improve the effectiveness of how you do probation and your community in promoting positive youth development and community safety. And joining me today are Judge Susan Ashley from New Hampshire and Chief Probation Officer Tim Wires from Ohio. They will be sharing more about themselves when they talk about the processes they have been involved in to lead their jurisdictions in probation change and transformation. Specifically, they will be describing efforts underway in their court systems to shift the philosophy and approach to probation supervision to focus on youth behavior change and skill building, and to use assessment tools and minimum conditions of probation as supports for meaningful and relevant behavior change. Many of you are likely aware of the work that the Annie E. Casey Foundation has been doing for several years to transform juvenile probation and court responses to youth. Annie E. Casey has supported using research, the science of adolescent development, and public resources more efficiently to both reduce crime and also to reduce the harms that inappropriate and ineffective responses of the court system cause to youth, their families, and their communities. Many of you likely have participated in the Annie E. Casey's Juvenile Detention Alternative Initiative, known as JDI, and that the focus of that has been to divert youth away from the juvenile court and a system of detention and surveillance. And your participation in today's webinar suggests that you are interested in additional strategies and steps that your jurisdiction can take to further improve your probation practices. We appreciate your interest and hope to encourage and inspire you to stay committed to change and reform. As you'll be hearing from our faculty, change is a process, and you'll hear a timeline from some of the faculty about when they started change and where they're at with the process. So we know that these things don't happen overnight, and we also appreciate that people, professionals and practitioners, need to receive support and encouragement and kudos along the way, because it is a process. And we know that change takes time and often does not follow a smooth or clear path. The National Council has been partnering with Annie E. Casey for several years to create guidance and resources for practitioners, especially judicial officers, to support the process of system transformation. Today's webinar is the first of 3 webinars that we are offering this summer to unpack and bring to life a toolkit that the National Council, with input from judges, created especially for judges to have a role in leading juvenile probation transformation. We'll be talking further about that toolkit as a resource for you and your colleagues. Well, if we could advance a slide. And here, I'm just a reminder, or just sharing, that the Annie Casey is funding some of the work that the National Council is doing around probation transformation. And just to say that the points of view or opinions are those of the faculty and the presentation team, and do not necessarily represent the official position or policies of the Annie Casey Foundation or the National Council. So before we get into information on the toolkit and the experience that our faculty has had in providing leadership in their communities on transforming probation, we wanted to learn something about you as our participants in today's webinar. And we have a few poll questions to ask. And Malika, will you help us with those questions? So I think the first poll that we want to bring up has to do with letting you know what your role is in your organization or your affiliation. If you would take a moment to answer the poll, we hope that the options are relevant ones, but pick the one that best fits you. So I'm not sure if we're getting any responses. Malika, how's that going?
We're getting a few responses. We got 12 of 15.
Okay.
So I'll go ahead and end it.
Okay.
And here are the results.
Okay, great. So we have judicial officers, and we appreciate that in the professional world, peers like to hear from peers. And so you'll be hearing from Judge Ashley is up here, and then probation administrators, very nice. Then Tim Wires is the chief probation officer. So Tim, you have some colleagues out there that you'll be speaking to. And then we have some other folks. So thank you very much, everyone, for letting us know about your role. And then we have another question kind of about your familiarity with the toolkit that we'll be talking about. So the publication is called The Role of the Judge in Transforming Juvenile Probation, a Toolkit for Leadership. If you would let us know about your familiarity with this publication and pick the option that best reflects your familiarity.
Okay, I'm gonna close it now.
So who's in the know? Okay, some are very familiar, some are somewhat familiar, a few have heard of it only, and some don't know about it. So I'm delighted especially to reach those of you for whom this resource is brand new. By the end of the webinar, we hope that you'll be excited to delve into the toolkit and see how it could be useful to you. So thank you on that one, Malika. And then our last poll has to do actually with some of the topics that the toolkit covers regarding probation transformation practices. And so we wanted to hear from you about what practices are underway in your community or jurisdiction that we are associating with probation transformation. And so one is the individualized goal-oriented case planning practice. Another is using incentives and rewards to support behavior change. Minimizing the conditions of probation, alternatives to confinement to respond to violations, and then probation as a disposition for youth involved in serious delinquency. If you would pick any or all of those practices that you are trying to implement or have implemented in your jurisdiction, that would be super helpful.
Okay, we have 10 people so far, 11. All right, looks like that's where it stops. There you go.
Super. Well, we have, it looks like a lot of experience and work going on with individualized goal-oriented case planning, 91%, that's excellent. And then having alternatives to confinement as a way to respond to violations, that's 100%, that's fantastic too. And then the areas where it looks like people have begun some work, but maybe have not gotten as far along as these other practices include incentives and rewards and conditions of probation, and then probation is a disposition for youth with serious offenses. Well, good. So today, for those of you who are still very much in the process of working on minimum conditions of probation, we hope that you'll get some ideas from today's webinar that will help you move that work along even more. So today's learning objectives have to do with increasing your familiarity with the toolkit, learning about how the two jurisdictions that we're featuring today, Stark County, Ohio, and the state of New Hampshire, are transforming probation, especially around organizational culture, creating tools to divert youth from probation, and having minimal conditions of probation for youth. And then from our speakers, we hope that you'll be learning some strategies for addressing any challenges that might be coming up in implementing probation reform. Thank you, Malik. If you could take us to the next slide. Here's a little background on the National Council's involvement in the field of probation transformation. We actually had, actually, if you could go back, there we go. The council actually passed a resolution in 2019 committing to probation transformation and to having adolescent development inform our approaches to working with young people, rather than having practices developed in the adult system inform what we do with juveniles. And so we had the judges themselves adopt this resolution that calls for having judges being trained and knowledgeable on adolescent development, and also encouraging probation staff to be knowledgeable of this research and science, and then to have our strategies in working with youth be informed by the brain science and understanding adolescent development, and focusing more on skill building and long-term behavior change. And Tim will be talking a lot about this mindset of skill building. But the council itself has come out with this policy statement, basically, that embraces probation transformation. And we have there's a link in the PowerPoint slide that would get you to the resolution itself to read the content of it. And then, Malik, if we could go to the next slide. For those of you who are unfamiliar with the toolkit, here's a visual. We had the front page of the toolkit in this slide, and it is a digital electronic publication rather than something in hard copy, but you can download it to print it out. And just the contents of the toolkit, it provides some background to the council's work and NCJFCJ's efforts to involve judges in probation transformation. The toolkit itself focuses on 5 practices, which I'll be mentioning in a minute. And importantly, it really focuses on how judges can play a role in supporting and transforming probation. We know that judges, depending on your jurisdiction and the laws, the state laws, and the relationship that the judiciary has with probation, in some locales, judges have a very close relationship with overseeing probation. And in other states or communities, probation is a separate entity, and maybe it's administered from a state level organization or agency. And so judges may not have the direct influence that they might have if probation was under them. But regardless of your jurisdiction's laws and situating judges in that context, judges certainly have a role and can influence the probation practice. And that's really what the toolkit celebrates and wants to lift up and help judges navigate and take advantage of the influence that you can have to improve practice. So Malika, if we could go to the next slide. This is getting into some of the content of the toolkit. We had asked earlier in our poll what probation practices are being reformed in your jurisdiction, and we asked about 5 in particular, and the toolkit focuses on these 5 as well, because we think that judges play a role in influencing these practices. So they have to do with individualized goal-oriented case planning, using incentives and rewards, and that's so tied into adolescent development. Adolescents pay much more attention to things that are going to be rewarding and pleasurable, and seek those out rather than seeking to avoid things that are unpleasant. Adults, we've learned, are much more sensitive to the sanctions as a way to shift their behavior, and youth are much more oriented to incentives as a way to support behavior that we want them to engage in. And then other practice areas that the toolkit focuses on include minimizing conditions of probation, alternatives to confinement to respond to violations, and then using probation as a disposition for youth with serious offenses. So these are the key probation transformation practices that the toolkit really addresses. There may be other practices that are relevant to probation transformation, but these are the ones that the toolkit really tries to hone in on. And with the next slide, we'll see specifically what the toolkit offers regarding these practice areas. The toolkit for each of the practice areas, it really spells out what is the changed practice that we're recommending. And then we share the research behind the practice and what we know about what works and what doesn't work related to the practice area. We also, in the toolkit, help practitioners and judges understand how to use the practice to promote race equity, how to use data when you're making practice change. And the toolkit also recognizes you're going to have challenges to implementing any of the changes, the practice changes that the toolkit covers. So we recognize those, and we also offer some suggestions and about how to address them. And then we also provide guidance to judges both on the bench and off the bench on how they can lead change for these practice areas. And Malika, thank you. Malika just added to the chat the link for the downloading the toolkit. Okay. So if we could go to the next slide, Malika, that's all background context. And now what you've been waiting for probably, I'm sure, is really hearing from our faculty about what they've been experiencing and suggestions they have for implementing transformational practices. And so the focus of today's webinar is on minimizing conditions of probation and moving from long lists of what to do, what not to do that we've been giving use over the years to minimal conditions, and some of what needs to happen in terms of a changed mindset in the workforce, judges and probation officers, if we're going to use minimal conditions to help promote behavior change, what needs to go along with that. And so that's what we'll be focusing on in today's webinar. And what you see in front of us is a sample from the toolkit of a court order that basically has, if you can see, there's a lot of writing, but if you can see the bullet points are really this probation order basically has 4 bullets or 4 conditions, if you will. And so it's really an effort to streamline everything that the kids have to keep in mind, and their parents and their probation officers about what they need to be doing, and to really have it be the essential things that we want kids to be aware of and work on. And Tim and Judge Ashley will be talking a little bit about, well, especially Judge Ashley will get into more detail about the minimal conditions of probation that the state of New Hampshire has come up with and will be implementing starting in July. So again, the toolkit provides a sample, but today's faculty are going to be talking about their work and their efforts in their jurisdictions. And Malika, if I could have the next slide. So basically, for what we'll be hearing about is the experience of Stark County, Ohio, which Tim Wires, who will be speaking with you about his community, let me know that it's the city name that you might be familiar with is Canton, Ohio, and that's really the Stark County, Ohio area. And then, and Tim will be talking about the organizational cultural shift that he helped to lead to make other probation transformational practices possible. And some of that is a professional journey, and some of it's been a personal journey. So we're glad to hear from Tim on that. And then we'll be learning about the state of New Hampshire and the new assessment tool that New Hampshire folks developed, and some of the shifts that have been taking place in probation workforce assignments. So some officers who were doing one kind of work before have shifted to the assessment work. And then we'll be hearing about the conditions of probation that will be going into effect shortly from Judge Ashley. So thank you all for bearing with me leading up to hearing from Tim Wires and Judge Ashley. But before we actually hear from Tim, I wanted to get another poll in here to learn from you about where you see your jurisdiction at when it comes to the culture of your probation workforce. And so we'll have a poll that comes up on the choices are, do you feel like your the culture of your probation folks is really around compliance and surveillance? Do you feel like it's really moving towards a culture that embraces youth development and focusing on skill building, incentives, and coaching. Or maybe your folks are in transition and some are have one orientation and others have the other orientation. Or it's possible that you're not sure what the orientation is of your department. So please pick the option that seems to fit best for you. How are we doing? Oh, good. So we get transformation of culture underway here. Very nice. And it seems like not quite a half of folks would say there's a mix. So there's still a process underway for helping everybody to be on the same page, hopefully in that positive youth development mindset and the life coach kind of role. So thank you very much. And I think at this point, let us turn to Tim Wires and Stark County to hear about the work underway there. Tim, take it away.
Well, thank you so much. And good morning or good afternoon, everyone. First, I'd like to thank Martha and everyone at NCJ and FCJ for allowing me to be here today, as well as my partners at the AECF Foundation. You know, my job today is to walk you through my journey of change from being very, and I mean very enforcement minded, to now having a coach's mindset. And you're going to hear me use this phrase possibly throughout the day, but the body can only go where the mind allows it. And that is so true for me. But again, just to remind everybody, if you have any questions, anything along those lines, please feel free to kind of pop it in the chat. I know that Martha and Malika will be kind of focusing on that. But one of the goals in the toolkit were for me really the challenges of implementing these practices, because in order for me to really kind of tell the story of how I viewed probation, I have to start with my history of hard wiring, right? And I've been with Stark County Family Court for 19 years, chief of probation going on 4 years. I'm still a special deputy with the Stark County Sheriff's Office, and I've been serving with them for a total of 16 years. And up until June of last year, I served as part of the U.S. Marshals Northern Ohio Violent Fugitive Task Force. And I was with them for about 6 years. I was also, and still am, an instructor for the Supreme Court of Ohio. I've been serving with them for 15 years, and I've taught such classes such as armed self-defense, search and seizure, verbal defense, and influence. But my most recent certification, and I will tell you that this certification has been the one that has stretched me, twisted me, and pulled me the most, was becoming a certified life coach. And I've been one of those for the past 2 years. But I share my history with you because for the first 15 years of my career, I was very hardwired in my thinking. And when JDAI was first introduced, I had a very hard time. Next slide, please. So when I say I had a very hard time, I was taken out of my comfort zone. And not only was I taken out of my comfort zone, but I was also put into a new position of taking over the department as chief of probation. And I'll be very honest with you. I thought, you know, and here in Stark County, we have 3 judges. I thought one of them lost a bet, right? I thought that for some reason, you know, this was just a creative way to get Tim to kind of, you know, set sail, and he's never going to be able to make it. But boy, was I wrong. I was wrong in myself, and I was wrong in everything that I thought that my judges saw in me. But Les Brown always has this really cool saying that sometimes you have to believe in the belief that others have in you before you believe in yourself. And I can't thank my judges and administration enough, because they believed in me and they saw something in me that I, at the time, couldn't see. Because initially, right, when we start to go through change, we have to find out the information, we have to disprove it, right? That was my arrogance at that point in time, that I wanted to prove or disprove JDAI and that, I wanted to win the argument, right? And I'm going to win the argument because, I've been a probation officer for a long time and I'm good at winning arguments, right? Or so I thought. And then that shifted to this will never work, and when I started going through the this will never work phase, I actually went and signed up for my local community college, and I was going to go into, the closet that you open up at your courthouses. Everybody has them nowadays that, have the blinky boxes and the wiring going everywhere. It says Cintas on the side. Yeah, I was going to be that guy. I was going to go into cybersecurity, and that was going to be my next new thing, right? Well, I signed up for classes, and I quickly realized, I didn't even make it through my first class, that I realized that this was not for me. But I still had this nagging thought because, again, what about public safety? And, I help offenders all the time, and I go to their houses and I talk to them all the time. I'm good at talking, right? I mean, otherwise I wouldn't be here, and I warn them, and I let them know that, what they're doing is wrong. And well, by all means, I warn them a couple of times before I send them back to court, but, they just don't get it. And it really got to a point where I thought to myself, I've been locking people up for over 15 years now. It's all I know. And then it transitioned to what do you mean I'm the new chief? So I really, in the first few or the first few months of this, I really struggled. But what I realized was, for the very first time, that what I was feeling was exactly how I made youth and families feel on a daily basis. And I would give families a list of conditions and rules that, I'd ask them to follow. And then I would ask them if they had any questions. And then I'd send them on their way, only to see that the youth usually began to fail within the first week, if not sooner, not realizing that I just scrambled their neural computers. I pulled out their neural hardwiring and their neural pathways, and then I couldn't figure out why they couldn't quite get it. So I call it the fire hose effect. So imagine if a firefighter is trying to put out a fire, and you walk up to the firefighter and you smack that hose out of their hand. Well, what's that hose going to do? It's now pushing out all this pressure and it's pushing out water, but it initially had a place to go. It had a purpose. It had a hardwired direction. But once it's smacked out of the firefighter's hand, it's now in a situation where not only is it not putting out the fire, but it's also spraying water everywhere, and we're going to drown. That's how I felt, was that my neural pathways were all over the place. Next slide, please. So you eventually get to a point where it's kind of like the stages of grief, right? Where you eventually have to make a decision. And, I had to say, should I stay or should I go? Well, I'm still here. So I chose to stay. And in 2019, we started doing JDAI in 2018, but I can remember this like it was yesterday. In 2019, I attended a meeting put on by the Department of Youth Services here in Ohio. That's our juvenile prison system. And I can remember the bureau chief, Tony Panzino, along with a couple of representatives from the Annie Casey Foundation, bring all of our targeted reclaim courts into the same room. And the message was very, very clear. They said, you have until July 1st of 2019 to institute more of an evidence-based approach to working with kids, and to change and moving away from surveillance and enforcement and move toward coaching, service implementation, and case management, or we will defund you. So that was another very, very large toll of a bell that was rung in my ear. And I can remember, because I read, there was this article from Dr. Ed Latessa from the University of Cincinnati and Dr. Brian Lovins and a couple other co-authors that talked about how do you move from a referee, which I was an enforcer. I wouldn't even say I was a referee, but how do you move from being a referee to a coach? And I had coached sports before in the past, but I never had ever thought about coaching somebody to reach their fullest life potential or their fullest definition of success for them. And it was at that point in time when that old saying of when the student is ready, the coach will appear, that my new mentor, Mr. Jack Canfield, did appear. And that name may sound familiar to some of you, and some of you may know exactly who that is, but Mr. Jack Canfield is one of the co-authors of the Chicken Soup for the Soul series. And I thought, I started really researching, how do you coach people to be successful? And that took me down the whole self-help road, right? With Jim Rome and Jack Canfield and a lot of other authors. But what I noticed was that Jack had not only, and I was just looking for a place to go watch him speak, right? That was my biggest hope. But lo and behold, I tripped across his work and I found that he had a certification program. And I got certified starting in 2019, and it took me all the way through up to 2021 to get certified in his methodology. It was a lot of work. And like I said, it was one of the hardest trainings that I'd ever been through, because again, we were taking those neural pathway fire hoses, we were pulling them out of their sockets, and now we were trying to find new fires for them to address, put out, and get plugged back into. So I was able to find this methodology, and I started to figure out, this is how I'm going to help probation officers make the switch, because, well, if I can do it, they can do it. But it was very hard. It was a very long process. And as I started going through this process, I started moving further and further away from law enforcement. But then I found myself in this real conflict of, well, now who am I? And I really started to really struggle in that realm. But again, next slide, please. When we talk about an organizational culture shift, my staff started watching me change, and they watched me transform and shift from an enforcer to a coach. And I mean, it was a drastic change, from the clothes that I wore to the equipment that I carried. And this took place from over 2019 through 2020. And it came to a final end as far as enforcement was concerned on March 24th of 2021. Now, I really like this quote, and it's by Napoleon Hill, that every negative event contains within it the seed of an equal or greater benefit. And ladies and gentlemen, I will tell you that never in a million years would I have guessed that what was about to happen to me, that I was going to use every single skill Jack taught me, not for the kids and families of Stark County, not for the probation department of Stark County, but I was going to use them for myself. Next slide, please. So the one thing that was still there were still remnants of enforcement. See, I was still a member of the U.S. Marshals Violent Fugitive Task Force. And 3 days after my graduation, on Wednesday, March 24th, 2021, at 5:17 p.m., I was shot in the line of duty. This picture would be the last day that I would be serving as a U.S. Marshal Task Force member. The gentleman you can see in the slide, and I apologize, it's a little grainy, but it's from the perspective of the police officer right before I was shot, in a still footage from his vest camera. But this is Aaron Pierre Thomas, who came running out of the apartment that we had surrounded because he was a violent fugitive out of Virginia. And this was right before he shot me. Now, his first bullet hit me in the leg and on the right tibia, which is your shin bone. For those of you that don't remember the anatomy, it was your right shin bone, and the bullet went through and took a chunk out of my bone and immediately put me on my knees. Which that to me was divine intervention, because the second bullet he put was directly over my head. You can see in the picture, he was 20 feet in closing, and it was kind of a shootout at the OK Corral. But again, this was my job on that day. And I know what you're thinking, why is a juvenile probation officer, why was he even there? See, that was our agreement. The U.S. Marshal Service said, we will help you track down any potential girl, any potential boy, anything along those lines when it comes to human trafficking. We will go in and help you serve the worst of the worst and be safe doing it. But Tim, you're part of the deal and you're on loan to us 1 day a week. And I don't regret my decisions. I don't regret anything along those lines. We were able to, again, put a lot of people behind bars that were not safe individuals. But if you take a look at the right part of your screen, you can see the little John Deere tractor. That's because little kids live there. And this was a neighborhood that for 60 seconds, we turned into a war zone because we fired over 30 rounds within point blank range of each other. And I'm going to use this phrase that I stole from Steve Bishop from the Casey Foundation. Is the juice worth the squeeze? Now, listen, ladies and gentlemen, I'm not here to influence anyone on how they enforce court orders or try and sway anyone when it comes to their opinion on how their probation department should run. These are very difficult times. And even here in Stark County, we have 7 youth in detention for either complicity to commit or aggravated murder charges. So I get it, okay? But again, I'm going to ask, is the juice worth the squeeze for your officers, given what we now know, what works with juveniles, as far as their own development, as far as, all of the literature that is out there. But just let me kind of highlight some of the worst case scenarios when it comes to enforcement and surveillance. Next slide, please. So obviously the worst case in my situation is I wouldn't be here talking to you. I wouldn't be here sharing. I wouldn't be with my family. I wouldn't be with my judges. I wouldn't be with my court administrators. I wouldn't be with the staff here. But it started off for me as acute stress disorder. And that typically is how it works. When it comes to acute stress disorder, that then metastasizes into post-traumatic stress disorder. Roughly 30 days after the shooting is when I got my diagnosis with PTSD. The medication came on because my brain had now changed. And, again, I go back to that quote by Napoleon Hill: every negative event contains within it the seed of an equal or greater benefit. I now have a very intimate relationship with PTSD that I have a greater understanding to pass on to the staff, to pass on to understand how to work with kids and families. Because again, you don't have to necessarily have a shooting take place to know that our kids and families go through trauma all the time. But my brain had changed. And if you were to take a snapshot of my brain prior to the shooting and prior or post-shooting, you would see that the amygdala is now larger. And the medication helped me regain balance because that then moved into the dialectical behavioral therapy because my brain was out of balance. My fight, flight, or freeze responses were constantly on fire. So that then moved into eye movement and disassociation and reprocessing therapy because my nightmares and my flashbacks were so intrusive that it would really affect how I was thinking and being able to focus. Then working through the critical incident response team debrief by the United States Marshal Service, that was right after the shooting. That moved on into the Bureau of Criminal Investigations investigation that was handed off by the sheriff and the U.S. Marshals because we needed to have a fair and impartial lens on this shooting. Because again, I'm who I am. They didn't really know how to classify me. They didn't know if I was a juvenile probation officer. They didn't know if I was a special deputy, and they didn't know if I was a U.S. Marshal. But let me tell you, judges and court administrators, it all came back on the court. I don't care what MOU you sign. I don't care what it says in the fine print. This all came back on my judges. This came back on my court administrators, my county commissioners. That was all on them. Then handling the investigation, because again, I was part of a criminal investigation. Not to mention the prosecutor's office is in the courthouse where I am. We're all kind of one big building, and riding the elevators up with the prosecutors that I've known and worked with for years. And even though they could have recused themselves, they're reading the report. They know what happened. And so in my brain, again, as imbalanced as it is, are they looking at me? Are they getting ready to indict me? Are they, even though my shooting was as right as rain, it was still a situation that the fear was palpable for me. Helping my family understand now that my kids, that their dad has changed. My wife, her husband has changed. And that now they have to change on how they interact and how we deal with each other and things of that nature. And then, my staff, calling my court administrator from the back of an ambulance as I'm being rushed with police cars flanking it. I can tell you there were some colorful words that day that I will not, based on decorum, repeat, but there were some pretty colorful descriptions. I can tell you that I've had nothing but support, love, and concern. But again, wanting to explain to my staff was incredibly important. And I say my staff because I take ownership of them, because we are, just like I'm sure everyone else's is a big family. But being able to explain to them what I've been through could, and I don't want it to ever be construed as it will derail the efforts that we had made to that point. Will Tim now be biased as the chief of probation? I can tell you that the one good part about this is that we have so many safeguards in place now that truly stood the test of this event. So next slide, please. So I will tell you, ladies and gentlemen, that I do not recommend or condone exposing staff to traumatic events, but it works. Any remnants of enforcement or surveillance, that pretty much put the nail in the coffin when it came to that. So that's definitely definitely something to the point where, again, it's the seed of an equal or greater benefit that we're always looking for in this tragedy. But I will tell you, even though we've gone through changing our rules, and we used to have 12, we now have 4. We've implemented incentive grids, we've implemented intervention grids, and we've instituted an assessment system that makes violations racially and ethnically equitable in their application. We spend the vast majority of our time now on skill building, on implementing our cognitive behavior therapies with our youth based on their case plan. And we've developed and implemented a success modules, virtual success module principles for our staff to not only help the staff transition to be better coaches, but also to help our kids understand how to define success for themselves. Now, again, this doesn't mean that we don't take precautions, because we do. We have to be very situationally aware of the areas that we go into. But the benefit here is that the kids don't see us the same way anymore. They don't see us as enforcers. They don't see us as who we used to be portrayed as. They see us as supports. They see us as coaches. They see us as mentors. They see us as somebody that they can call to help them work through their life. Next slide. This is a screenshot of one of our success principles. And again, after becoming a certified coach, I took the material that was taught to me, and with the help of some really great people on our staff, they're so inventive, they are so creative, that we were able to take the success principles and turn them into interactive video modules. And it was introduced to the staff to help them understand, one, what's the concept of a coach? And And they're now interactive modules. So as you watch the module, you can press pause and work through the questions that have now been presented in front of you. There's a total of 8 modules, and there's still 8 more in pre-production. But the cornerstone of all of our modules is taking 100% responsibility. And that's a very heavy concept, but again, the modules are very motivational, and it's very user-friendly for the staff to have a guided and meaningful conversation, not just a check-in with their youth and families. But it focuses on the success principle of E plus R equals O. Now, I know this is not a new concept, right? But again, when it comes to this formula, no matter what the events are that you experience in life, as long as you control the R's or the responses, we can always come out with much better outcomes. Next slide. And ladies and gentlemen, I will tell you that, listen, please take my word for it, that I practice what I preach. You don't have to go through what I went through by any stretch of the imagination, but when you control your R's, this is a great example of getting some pretty cool outcomes. So the U.S. Marshals had a Purple Heart ceremony for myself and my family. It's the highest award that can be bestowed by the U.S. Marshals. And my kids here in the picture with my wife, my daughter plays softball, my son plays baseball. And for us to be at Progressive Field where the Guardians play at home plate, to be pictured there was a pretty cool outcome. So if it can work for me, ladies and gentlemen, and that's my time, it can work for anybody. So I want to thank you again. Thank you again, Martha, and thank you again, John, for allowing me to be a part of this. And I want to turn it over to Martha so that Judge Ashley can take over from here. Thank you.
Thank you, Tim. Thank you so much. That was quite an experience to share. That was very personal, but then you found a way to translate it into professional outcomes that are influencing your staff and helping them make the switch from a law enforcement surveillance-oriented approach with kids that we know doesn't work as much as the life skill building coaching experience, and that your personal tragedy and injury had you experience firsthand what you began to realize is what many kids experience, and that in order to cope and recover from your experience, you needed help with your brain and your thought patterns and your emotions and so forth. And you got that help for yourself. And in doing so, you realized how powerful this kind of help and these tools were to give to your staff so that they can use them in their work with youth. So I can imagine that the participants are very interested in the success modules, and we have Tim's email address that we'll provide at the last slide. And so may I, on your behalf, offer for people to follow up with you if they have questions. Please. About the success principles and the modules. It sounds very exciting, and I bet we could even have a webinar program just on the highlights of your success module. But thank you so much, Tim, for sharing your experience, and I hope people have been inspired to see how changes can take place in surprising ways, and that we can learn from experiences to put us in the shoes of others that we want to help and be more effective in how we help them. So at this point, let's shift to Judge Ashley and talking about probation transformation in New Hampshire. And Malika, in the interest of time, let's just jump over to Judge Ashley's first slide where she's going to be talking about her context. So we'll move past that. There we go. And then Judge Ashley, please take it away. And thank you for your patience.
Sure. Well, good afternoon, everyone. And thank you again to NCJFCJ, Martha, for inviting me here today. And also all of the support that New Hampshire has received from any Casey Foundation, and John Cookus has been right by our side through all of this. So next slide, please. So New Hampshire was fortunate enough to be part of the Georgetown program A couple of years ago, we went down in 2019, and this is just a list of the individuals from New Hampshire. We have an 8-member team. We're all still on the team with the exception of one person has swapped out, and this was down in Georgetown. And I just threw the slide in there not to have to show a picture of ourselves, but we weren't supposed to be up in this area of the library. And I just thought it epitomized, we managed to accomplish a few things over the last couple of years that folks thought could not be done. So I guess we started in Georgetown by doing things we weren't supposed to do, and we didn't get in trouble for it. So anyway, next slide, please. So as a result of the Georgetown program, New Hampshire needed to develop a capstone project, and we did that. It has various components to it, but the two primary areas were really on the front end of juvenile justice issues and then on the back end. So the first part of it was to develop a pre-court assessment for youth, where we would be able to actually assess youth when they encountered law enforcement before a petition was filed against them. And for all the various reasons why we would know that would be appropriate. On the back end, we wanted to tackle the rules of probation. In New Hampshire, they're called rules of conditional release, but everyone knows it's the rules of probation. And some slides ahead will discuss how we managed to do that. But essentially, we wanted to focus on rules that would be individualized, that they would be racially, ethnically, and trauma informed in the response to the youth that were being put on probation ultimately. And so if we can go to the next slide, please. So this is, I'm sure I'm preaching to the choir here as to why we want to divert youth from court, but this is certainly part of our message to New Hampshire folks who deal with juvenile justice. And that was that it is certainly better for youth to be held accountable by their families and in their own communities if there is some involvement with legal issues. And that, diversion can build on the youth's strengths, which is really what juvenile justice is all about. Keep them connected with positive influences. We want to avoid harm, obviously, in any circumstance in juvenile justice. And we know from the research that juvenile justice systems can do more harm than good if you are putting low-risk juveniles on probation, and there can be a minor violation, and that can just pull them deeper and deeper into the system. And also, who doesn't have insufficient resources? We want to make sure that we are giving the resources that we have, the limited resources that we have, to those who really need those resources. And so sort of the monthly check-ins that some probation officers have had with kids really isn't effective at all. And we recognize that. Next slide, please. So this, I just threw together this timeline for those who are thinking about, making major efforts in their counties or states. This is really how it played out. Again, I mentioned the Georgetown Center for Juvenile Justice Reform that we went to in November of 2019. We worked on our capstone proposal. Of course, March 2020, we all know what happened then, pandemic hit. But nevertheless, we proceeded ahead and were able to work throughout 2020 on developing proposed legislation, and that it was going to impact those front end cases, as I mentioned. In January 2021, we did our kickoff, and huge thumbs up to the tech assistance that we received from the Annie Casey Foundation. We essentially had a Zoom preliminary training, if you will, for over 400 people were able to join that. We invited everyone who we could think to invite, and really used that as an opportunity to provide some education to, the masses of folks on adolescent brain development, on the statistics with regard to probation nationwide, the benefits and detriments to probation for youth. And so from that kickoff, we then had what we referred to as affinity groups, because we wanted to be able to talk with folks in their own comfort zone. So we had affinity groups, we had a meeting for the judges, and we had a meeting for the probation officers, we had a meeting for defense counsel, for prosecutors, we had one for sort of service providers and other policymakers. And that allowed them to provide feedback. Of course, these were all remote meetings because that's the circumstance we were under in this time frame. And then from there, we took the input from these individuals. And of course, we were discussing the concept of juvenile transformation with all of them. We then had the multidisciplinary, what we called convenings. And we had a handful of those through 2021 with, again, whomever were able to join us on those remotely. So a couple of other highlights, and we then moved towards our secondary process in our transformation, and that was to revise the rules of probation. In New Hampshire, our rules of probation are a court rule, and so that has to go through the Supreme Court to make any changes. And there's, of course, public comment available. There's a public hearing that occurs. So we made the proposal in July of 2021. So circling back to our legislation, it was in August that the legislation actually passed, which was great to see. I'll talk about that in just a moment. And but the effective dates for the legislation, that we divided the state into thirds because we knew we did not have the capacity to train everybody at once on such a significant change. So a third of the state, it was effective January 1 of 2022. The next third is effective July 1, just in a couple of weeks of 2022. And the last group is in October, on October 1st. So we started off with 4 trainings for that first cohort on the new law change. And these are our first in-person trainings in our probation transformation efforts. So finally, by December, we were able to get out to the locations because we really wanted to connect with the stakeholders and be able to answer any questions that they had. Next slide, please. So this is the actual purpose and findings that our legislature made when they enacted the revisions to this particular provision of our juvenile statute, which dealt with juvenile diversion. And just a couple of highlights. It just indicates, I'm not going to read through all of this due to time, but their slides are available to you. But essentially, the legislature decided that it was important to give our probation department the authority to do an assessment before a petition was filed. And that by doing so, they would be able to make referrals to our children's behavioral health system or to other supports and services, and that would then increase the use of diversion and decrease the need for future judicial involvement. So next slide, please. The actual statute itself, and again, these are just slides up there for your benefit. In a nutshell, it requires a law enforcement or prosecutor who intends to bring a juvenile petition to make a referral to our probation department first. And then that the department has 30 days to complete that referral process. And they reach out to the youth, they reach out to the parents, and they do a brief CANS assessment. I'll talk a moment about what CANS stands for. And then they issue a report back to the prosecutor or the law enforcement, whoever made that referral to the department. And that indicates, it makes recommendations about what may be appropriate to provide services for that youth. Sometimes the recommendation is that a petition should be filed based on the nature of the offense and the youth's needs. But it could be other community-based resources that are recommended. So that goes back to prosecution, but ultimately the prosecution has the discretion to decide whether or not to file. So it still lies with them. This just gives them very important information in advance. Next slide, please. Of course, there are exceptions if there's an emergency need for detention or placement because of a critical event that has occurred, then they certainly can file that petition before going through that 30-day assessment process. And I'll just mention this, it is a voluntary process for the parents and youth to participate in. If they decline, there'll be a report back to prosecution just indicating that they declined the process, and it's likely that they would be proceeding with a petition at that point if they did decline. And then the assessment itself, of course, is confidential. It's not to be used for proving any adjudication. It really is intended to be able to determine the strengths and needs of the youth. So we have provisions in there about confidentiality. Next slide, please. So the actual assessment tool that New Hampshire is using now is called the CANS, this Child and Adolescent Needs and Strengths tool. And the true benefit here is that this tool is being used across all of our child-related agencies. So Children's Behavioral Health is using the same assessment tool when they are meeting with children for behavioral health needs, completely aside from any delinquency or truancy cases, et cetera. So it's a tool, and it's being used in local mental health centers. It's a tool that everyone is becoming very familiar with and can be utilized and circled back to, because again, it is a way to check in with youth and see what their progress is. It has 6 domains that I'm not going to go through in detail, but key pieces of it, of course, are not just what the risks are for a child, but what their strengths are. It includes cultural factors that may be important, and it includes caregivers' strengths and needs. We hear this over and over, and have always heard this over and over, that it's not really the youth where the issues reside, but it's the family structure that is fueling the conduct. And so we get an assessment of that as well. Next slide, please. And so this is just, I know, a small print, but this is a snapshot of the needs assessment report that is completed following the CANS assessment. And it highlights the youth's strengths. It highlights actionable items. I'll talk more about that in a moment. And then it makes the recommendations that I had indicated earlier. Next slide. And these are just examples of how of what may be recommended for youth. So again, community-based services like diversion or multi-systemic therapy, youth advocate programs, those things are in the community. It could rise to the level of behavioral health services. And there's various acronyms. You may or may not have these in your area. But then, of course, additional options, of course, are filing a petition or going through our voluntary CHINS process or other actions that may be appropriate. And next slide for the presentation, please. This is our wonderful, colorful flow chart that is really hard to read, but we've laminated it for folks just to sort of stick on the wall so that they could fully understand the process. We've done extensive trainings with our probation officers and our prosecutors and defense lawyers and judges about this, but just wanted you to see that we do have it all sort of mapped out for folks so that they understand. It's new. Again, it's just starting in New Hampshire, and because it's so new, we want to make sure folks clearly understand what our process is. Next slide. So the rest of the work that we've been doing has really been more focused on the probation end of things, more timeline highlights. As I indicated, we did have a public hearing for the probation rules changes. We did have some opposition from our probation officers. We worked closely with the probation officers about changing these rules of probation and had multiple meetings with them, but nevertheless, they were still concerned with us having eliminated some, made recommendations to eliminate some of the rules that they wanted to still see on the books. And that really gets into that question earlier about where is your probation force at? We're certainly at a mix here in New Hampshire of those who simply are entrenched with enforcement. But nevertheless, we did ultimately have those rules approved in March of 2022. We've been working hard on developing an individual plan, which is a key part of the changes to the rules of probation, and I'll talk with you all about that shortly. But in the meantime, we did a training on that, again, statewide late in May. Because the rules of probation, the new rules are going to be in effect as of July 1. So we're all on the verge of starting to work with those. We just did 3 trainings for the middle third of the state on the new law change. And then we'll have final trainings to do in September. And finally, just an ongoing issue. This is but key issue that we're going to continue to collect data to be able to identify whether we're being successful in these efforts. We want to get input from the youth and families, of course, and also see where the gaps are in the state with regard to services. Next slide, please. So here's our list of conditions of release in New Hampshire right now. In effect now, going, get them while you can because they'll be gone in 2 weeks. You know, I couldn't even tell you what these are. If you forced me to list them off, I wouldn't even get all 20, and I've been doing this work for 15 years. Next slide, please. This is the new, why we're revising the rules? Well, I think that's probably obvious, but just in essence, none of those rules are identifying what the root causes are of the youth's delinquent conduct. We know technical violations push youth deeper into the system, and we really only need rules to apply to everyone that need to apply to everyone. Otherwise, it should be an individual plan for that particular youth. Next slide, please. And so here are the revised rules in New Hampshire. Pretty basic stuff: obey the laws, remain arrest-free, follow court orders, submit to reasonable searches, don't possess weapons. And then the key change is follow my identified individual plan. Next slide. So the individual plan is really going to be fueled by the CANS assessment that I mentioned earlier. So those actionable items that have been identified for the youth will be laid out. And then the idea is that there will be a meeting between probation officer, the youth, their parents, defense counsel, if they wish to participate. And they'll identify which actionable items should be in the youth individual plan. There could be many actionable items in this youth for this youth and family, but we do not want to make a list that is going to be insurmountable for a youth who's on probation. So we're saying it's going to be limited to 3 to 5 items, and it has to be achievable, and it has to be in plain language. So, and very important to have the ownership by having the youth participate in the process. Next slide. So here's just an example. For instance, we could have an actionable item that is oppositional behavior. We know that what that lingo is, but it doesn't mean the youth and family do. So, but they're defiant, they're disrespectful to their mother, they just don't listen. Like, that's where that issue is coming from. And the individual plan should have an item that could say something like, I'm going to improve the way I talk with my mom. And I'll work within home services, just basic concepts for the youth to understand what it is that they need to do, what's their responsibility going forward. Also, just before we go to the next slide, school issues are huge here in New Hampshire. I'm sure they are everywhere. But if you've got significant absenteeism, telling the youth to go to school isn't necessarily going to change anything. They're not going. Us telling them to go doesn't mean they're going to go. We want to get them involved to develop some kind of plan that's going to keep them in school. Next slide. And then here's, again, hard to see, but this is our one pager. It lists the conditions of release. It lists an area where we can spell out what the individual plan goals are. We hope this is something that can go on the fridge, so to speak, very clear and easy, so there won't be any confusion as what the responsibilities are for the youth, what the family is working with the youth on, and that it's very individualized to their needs. Whew. I think that's it for me. Next slide. Yes.
Thank you so much, Judge Ashley. Wow, you've laid out in a very quick space of a few minutes the entire process that New Hampshire has been undergoing for a few years now, and you've identified some really important strategies in place that I hope people find helpful. The folks who are listening to us today, you talked about getting stakeholder input, you talked about legislative change, you talked about developing new tools like your assessment tool and a new process, and the importance of training staff, collecting data, and the toolkit touches on those kinds of strategies. So I did want to connect on some of the New Hampshire's experience with the toolkit that we have available. So thank you so much for sharing your the work. It's underway. And again, I would invite people, if they have questions and want to hear more about your process or the conditions or how it worked with probation input, that they should feel like they can communicate with you and use your email address to ask their questions. We are about out of time, but I wondered actually if there were any questions that people had. We have a small number of folks. I don't know, Malika, if you can unmute anyone or if people want to put a comment or question in the chat. There are any questions for Judge Ashley? So one question I had, Judge Ashley, was actually in taking the approach of doing the strengths and needs assessment, have your communities realized that they need to develop some local resources to meet needs, that that if you're identifying certain services, say to divert youth, do they exist in the community, or are people working on creating more services?
That is one of the goals of the data that we're collecting. We have very preliminary data from 1/3 of the state for just a few months. and it's highlighting what the needs are in the communities. And so if we find, as we're making referrals out, that there's a lack of capacity to manage those needs, then we'll be able to support that with the data that we have from the Kansas assessments to say to the local folks to say, this is really a necessary service in your community, because here are all of the numbers of youths who could really benefit from that. So we haven't, it hasn't come far enough at this point to say, oh, there's a gap here. I mean, there's some obvious gaps that we know that we have, but we're definitely hoping to use that data to be able to improve what we have for youth in various communities.
Oh, what a great idea. That's, I love that. Have a social science background as an academician. And so whenever I hear anybody's planning to use data, I get very excited and want to encourage that work. There is a question in the chat about the individual plan. Let's see if I could bring it up, about the actual wording of who develops the individual plan that the youth is ordered to follow. Is that something that the Juvenile Probation Department does?
Yes, well, am I off mute? Yes, they are certainly going to be part of the conversation. What I can imagine will happen, again, hasn't started yet in New Hampshire, but in the trainings, is that it'll be the probation officer who will be working with the youth. Again, their parent and their defense lawyer, if they are part of that meeting, but ultimately this plan needs to be approved by the court. So it will be developed either by agreement of the parties and submitted to the court for approval, or there'll be a contested hearing at the dispositional, and we'll hear arguments as to what should be part of the individual plan for the youth, because the youth needs to know clearly what the terms are of their individual plan if they're going to be held accountable for that. So with regard to the second question about having the juvenile department develop the case plan, we're really not delegating it to them because we're approving it. Certainly they are making recommendations, but that's what they've always done anyway. Parties will come to us and say, here's our agreement to do this service or to do that consequence, and then the court makes a decision as to whether we approve it or not. And if we don't, then we have a contested hearing and we make the decision ourselves.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Judge Ashley, and thank you, Tim Wires, as well. We have run out of time. I'm so glad that we got the engagement from participants and had you, the faculty, be able to answer some of the questions that you have. But if others come up, please feel welcome to reach out to all of us. And I've learned from this webinar that for the next one, which we're having in July, I'm going to talk less so I can have the faculty talk more. But thank you so much, everyone, participants, for your time. We hope this was valuable. And again, thank you, Judge Ashley and Tim, for sharing your experiences with us.